Hi, everyone. I think it's the end of the break. So I'll be moderating this last session. I believe it's the last session of speakers. So first I'd like to introduce Dr. Holly Prendeville from the United States Department of Agriculture, USDA. So she is the coordinator of the USDA Northwest Climate Hub and Western Wildland Environmental Threat Assessment Center. Today, she'll be talking to us about supporting climate-informed land management decisions. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I believe you can see my screen okay? Excellent.
Yes.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for sticking in to the end of the symposium. It's been great to hear all the information shared thus far. During the symposium, we've heard from a number of scientists sharing the highlights from their research, and throughout I've asked and thought about land managers and technology transfer specialists that I work with and anticipate their questions on how do I apply this to my land management decisions. And I appreciate your responses to these questions throughout this symposium, as it helps me do my job. My presentation is going to be very different from many of those in this symposium. I'm going to share some ideas that may help you all share and translate your science so that it can get to land managers as well as policy developers, and also help us that focus on science translation share your great work. There's a lot of new information coming out. There's a lot of science coming out, particularly around climate change and when you start looking across multiple fields. It can be really challenging to stay on top of it and informed with all the new findings. And this becomes even harder when science isn't always accessible and that it's written in a very technical manner and may not be at this scale to inform decisions. So working with land managers to help them translate this information and then incorporate it into their decisions is much of what we focus on at the Climate Hub. Many of you work on one or more species and how its genetics and the environment affect it. I'll remind you to also remember about humans as another species to consider. Humans have a relationship with the land and have depended on the land for their existence. They've tended the land for thousands of years. Historically and today, indigenous communities work with the lands. For instance, they've removed death camas while it was flowering so that the later camas harvest would be safe for consumption. They've performed cultural and prescribed burns to support certain species, and they do other activities that promote the growth of plants for food, medicine, and ceremony. In some areas where these tendings from indigenous communities have stopped, the signature of their past actions is still present hundreds of years later. One of the many land management agencies that has land within the United States is the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Forest Service, the National Forest System. Also within the Forest Service is a research branch and research and development. The Forest Service was started back in 1905, which included the research branch. These are photos showing the Forest Service studying the land, plants, and water, as well as growing trees for reforestation. The Forest Service has a number of ecological research forests and grasslands, along with long-term experiments that give us insights how land management practices affect forests, water supply, water quality, fire, and other ecological processes. These activities continue today. Throughout time, the goals of land management have changed, as well as our understanding of plants in the land. Many federal lands support a variety of goals and uses, such as recreation, wildlife habitat, livestock forage, providing water to surrounding communities and urban communities, as well as providing a number of other ecosystem services and benefits. Land managers, whether they be private landowners, state, tribal governments, federal governments, they must all manage these lands for a variety of goals with limited resources. Land managers are facing a number of challenges beyond limited time and funds to implement these practices. I'll just touch upon a few here. We're seeing more extreme events like more impactful atmospheric rivers, hurricanes, droughts, and these can be challenges while trying to maintain the lands to achieve these multiple goals. Climate change has made the existing challenges even stronger by amplifying them, increasing their frequency, and has added new considerations and new challenges, making it even more difficult to make these decisions and balance societal and ecological needs. The uncertainty that's inherent with both climate change projections and management effectiveness make it difficult for land managers to incorporate climate change information into their management. We've heard a lot throughout this symposium, great highlights of recent research. Getting this information into land managers' hands can help inform them and help balance it with all of these conflicts and challenges that they face. I'm just going to highlight a few ways that we at the U.S. Department of Agriculture Climate Hubs work with land managers to help inform their land management decisions. I share this in hopes that this gives you a few options of ways that may appeal to your future research and outreach efforts. The U.S. Department of Agriculture's climate hubs are an interagency organization, and that within the department, we work and are led by the Forest Service, the research branch of it, the Agricultural Research Service, and the Natural Resources Conservation Service. For those outside of the U.S., these are two research-focused organizations, as well as one that focuses on helping private landowners implement conservation on their lands. We work across these different agencies in order to serve the US. There are 10 climate hubs and then one international climate hub. We develop and deliver science-based region-specific information and technologies with partners to enable climate-informed decision-making. Again, I'll share some aspects of how we work to achieve our mission, and hopefully they could be incorporated into your future efforts. I'll touch upon a few ways, and though I'm focusing more on land managers, much of this could also help with policy development as well. So these include science communication, working with end users to develop science together, as well as just sharing some research topics that I've heard recently when working with land managers that may be relevant to you all. Science communication and science translation are key. This means developing plain language summaries of your research in an accessible language. This, for many organizations, means developing materials that are at a middle school reading level, articles that are shorter in length, and then for those longer form articles, they usually tell a story and help connect to people and their values. A few years ago, Shane Snow wrote a blog sharing ideas about what reading level would be helpful to share science, and he did a comparison of a variety of documents of popular books at the time, policy documents, and scientific literature to evaluate their reading levels. This figure here is just showing what proportion or what percentage rather of Americans can read this information. As you can see, very few can read an academic paper, and so this science translation and science communication to a lower reading level is helpful. In addition, when talking among fields, there can be barriers because we all love using our jargon. And so when a hydrologist is planning a restoration effort to improve water flow and is looking at which plants to put in, you may not be making connections with the jargon from botanists or evolutionary ecologists. So again, developing those plain language summaries can help either working through a journal or your university to help make your research more accessible to a variety of individuals. And this is also relevant to policy developers. Just giving you an example of the plain language summary, assisted migration has come up throughout this symposium. So here's an example of a website we have trying to break down different ways that assisted migration can occur, as well as an infographic. Fun fact, many people, when they think of assisted migration, immediately go to species and don't think about populations and don't think about what we can do with moving different populations to areas. So it's helpful to break that down so they're not immediately thinking about what new species they should be planting. Likewise, if there's opportunities to developing a case study of how somebody's taken your research results and implemented it into their land management, that's helpful for other land managers to understand how they may be able to do that as well. Co-production is another option. This is working with land managers and engaging with them along this continuum. So much of science, we usually start off here, developing our research and publishing it in a journal. In this situation, there's really no engagement with land managers or end users of the science. And really, we're just sharing science among other scientists, and they may read the paper. As you proceed along this continuum, that one-way flow of information, giving a webinar, a talk, there's a few minutes for questions, so much more limited engagement here. Getting to an intermediate amount of engagement, you're engaging with land managers at a workshop. So not only may you give a talk, but then there's more time for them to talk about their specific project, the challenges they're facing, and try to work with them to interpret how to apply your research, your results from your work to their decision making. Now, as we continue down this continuum, it's for certain more time, more effort goes into these. With continuous engagement to diagnose together an issue, this would be multiple meetings with land managers and may also wind up bringing in multiple scientists in different disciplines to truly understand and get at the questions, because they may think it's a hydrology question, but maybe it's really a plant physiology question. And that's where it's helpful to bring folks together and come together to diagnose that issue. And then finally getting to the end, and we just saw an example of this with Maximilian's talk, of having that continuous engagement, incorporating the local needs and local knowledge in with the design and development of the experiment and even execution of it. And so this is the most time intensive, requiring a lot of time and effort to communicate, develop the ideas, and even design the experiments. However, this can allow the science to be very applicable at the scale the land managers need and have them better understand the results of the work. To give you two other examples of co-produced research, this first project was conducted by the Northern Plains Climate Hub and the Agricultural Research Service. This is the Collaborative Adaptive Rangeland Management Project. It had an overall goal to manage land and to be able to pass it on to the future. And in this project, they brought together scientists, nonprofit organizations, state, federal agencies that manage the land, along with ranchers that brought cattle onto the land to graze, and bird conservation organizations. Together, they developed specific goals related to vegetation, ranching operations, and wildlife, and were able to design and develop this experiment together. I'll add these links to the chat after my talk if you want to learn more about this study. Another one that's currently ongoing by the Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station is the Experimental Network for Assisted Migration and Establishment Silviculture, or ENAMES. We all love our acronyms. This one is examining assisted migration along with silvicultural practices so that they can help inform land managers what to plant, which practices are going to be helpful in order to maintain functional forest ecosystems in a changing climate. Touching upon a few research topics, these are things we do a lot of climate change vulnerability assessments. Folks let us know what their priorities are and what's important to them, but many times it's hard to find information as studies just haven't happened. One of those would be species that are important to indigenous communities. While the indigenous communities have traditional ecological knowledge and are very informed about the plant, understanding how that plant or how that species will be affected with climate change is much more limited and can be challenging with trying to understand what the vulnerability of a species may be that may have high cultural importance to that indigenous community. Likewise, for many other species, we don't understand their climate thresholds and where they'll perform well, or really how local is local? How far can you move something? And again, it's complex and challenging, but we're in the process of making these decisions, so any information on additional species can be really helpful. We've seen examples that some populations do well with 2 degrees Celsius, where others have a larger or smaller threshold. So it's helpful to have that understanding as decisions are being made and trying to decide where we're sourcing plant material for restoration efforts. Also understanding how climate change may affect species' abilities to provide these ecosystem services, such as pollinators or wildlife. We've heard about how some species are really sensitive to frost or have changes in phenology that may lead to mismatches with their pollinators. Again, understanding this information, sharing it broadly, can help land managers understand if they need to potentially put in additional species to support those pollinator populations to allow them to have a food source. Additionally, looking at interacting or cascading effects, drought, wildfire, disease, or herbivores, and climate change, and then how all of these interact with each other, or what happens when you have one after another. We've seen a number of times throughout the globe where a long prolonged drought is offset by a hurricane or extreme rains and flooding. And so how our populations existing, persisting through these extreme events, as well as how are they responding to the longer changes that are happening and changes in precipitation, increases in temperature, and changes in carbon dioxide. Our next talk is going to be focusing on the National Native Seed Strategy, which also has a number of research items, and I will not talk about that to let her do that. So with that, I will end, I think, a little early. Here's my email. I'm really happy to talk with you all and look forward to the discussion session.